Oops, I'm muted. Hello. You're muted.
Am I still muted?
Nope. All set.
Okay.
We'll give
So
it
then
another minute. Looks like some folks are joining us.
Okay.
Is your mouth okay?
Yes, it is. And my appointment tomorrow got bumped out to the afternoon. So, yeah. I'll be good as new here pretty soon.
Perfect. Let them start jumping on.
How many folks do we have today?
Last I checked, I think we had almost 50 register.
Oh, okay. All right. I've had a couple people say they couldn't be on it, but they're going to listen to the. Are you recording again today or not?
Yes. Yeah.
Oops. Something just happened.
Can you see me?
I can't.
What happened?
I don't know.
I can see and hear you.
Do you want to leave and join this? I don't know what happened here. Oh. Okay, I'm gonna have to leave meeting. I'm gonna have to leave. You can see me. I can't. Oh, there we go.
If you need to leave and log back in, did you get it?
I got it. Okay.
Okay. So it's 10 o'clock. While folks are still joining, I'm going to give some instructions to everyone. Thank you all for being here, first of all. Some of you have already been on some of these webinars that we've done, and so I'm just going to go through a couple of instructions for you. If you have, it's pretty much Andrea's webinar and instruction, and I'm sort of just her navigator. So if you have questions, please, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat, but you'll also see Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. It's easier for us to monitor that way. That way you don't get lost in and amongst the chat, and we're sure to get to all of your questions. We'll stop periodically at different points. So even if you see a question, if you type one in, don't think we're ignoring you. We'll get to it. We'll just have periodic stop points and check in on the questions. And same with like raising your hand if you've got a thought or anything. Just again, put it in the Q&A. The biggest thing too is we want to be mindful of everyone's time and respect to that. And so this way we have a little bit of control and it doesn't kind of go sideways. And I think I've covered it. So, and I'll do a reminder every once in a while because sometimes I see questions go into the chat, and I'll just remind you to put it there. But it's easier for me on my end if they're coming in fast and furious to just monitor from one place. And I'm going to say, take it away, Andrea.
Okay. Here we go. Okay. Okay, I hit the, okay, there we go. I think
Did you find your share screen?
Yes. Are we there?
It takes it a second. There we go.
Okay. All right, I'm going to make it as large as I can, which hopefully will help. And I'm just going to start from the RPA package, which you added to your transaction from your zip forms. So first form that always is going to come up in any of the packages, which they have car attorneys have prepared for us, is the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. Why is this the first form that comes up? It's the first form that comes up because it is required by law that you present this form, and it's a disclosure. It's not an agency confirmation, but it is a disclosure of the nature of agency relationships in the state of California. And the law requires that you present this to a principal prior to executing any sort of real estate documents. Actually, the law wants us to have this disclosure signed when we initiate any meaningful real estate discussions. It's just in actual practice doesn't usually play out that way. People are reluctant. They think you're trying to lock them into something, or I've had that reaction from people. And it simply is a disclosure, and it tells the principals that the nature of real estate agency in the state of California, we could be representing you as a seller's agent, we could be representing you as a buyer's agent, and that would mean only a seller's agent or only a buyer's agent, or we can, in the state of California, be representing you as both buyer and seller. Some states do not allow dual agency. So your entire company is either a buyer company or a seller company. But we allow dual agency, and the advantage of having that ability is that it allows us to show and sell the listings of other agents within our own company, because agency refers to the company, not the individual realtors who are affiliated within the company. This goes into a little bit about buyer and seller responsibilities. We do agency confirmation itself in the contract at paragraph 2 in the RPA. Page 2 of this disclosure is the civil code transcript regarding real estate agency. This page is presented and made available, but this does not require signature. Second form is the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Used to be called disclosure and consent. And what this is, I call this one, when I'm speaking to principals, this is the you're not the only child disclosure. And basically what this says is we as a company, or even me as an individual realtor, could be representing other buyers or sellers who are interested in either buying or selling real estate similar to what you have an interest in. So the purpose of this is there were lawsuits. Let's say I listed a house on C Street and got it on the market, and a week later Kelly listed a house further down the road, down the street and around the corner on D Street, same neighborhood. And for some reason, even though we went on the market sooner, Kelly's listings sold before mine. And that this disclosure, there were lawsuits. People were saying the company favored Kelly's listing and promoted hers and this and that and the other thing. None of that is the case. It's just a matter of, and this is what this disclosure has the purpose of, informing people that for whatever reason, Kelly's listing appealed to a buyer before your listing appealed to a buyer. So, and the same with buyers. We may be representing, I could be representing a buyer who's making an offer on a property. The same could be the same property that Kelly is making an offer on behalf of a buyer. And maybe Kelly's offer gets accepted and mine does not. Well, it's not because we were preferring that buyer. In fact, we shouldn't even be telling each other what we're submitting offers on. We want to keep that under our hat, because you never know who you're talking to and what they might, what clients they might be representing. That was one of the first things that my first broker told me is, you know, if you write an offer on something, keep your lip zipped. Don't get so excited you go broadcasting it. And I always tell my clients the same thing. Keep it under your hat until we have an accepted offer. All right, wire fraud. This one I can't overemphasize. We've had numerous cases throughout the country and in San Diego where there have been people victimized by wire fraud. And so this wire fraud advisory informs people of the risks of wire fraud and advises you to be very, very sure that where you're sending the money is the intended location. What we're finding in Southern California is that most escrow companies, or all the escrow companies I've had any contact with in well, the last quite a bit of time, they do not, when they send wire instructions, they're not putting account numbers on them. You have to call, the wire instructions have to be taken to the bank of the person needing to initiate the wire, and then they call and get the account number directly from the escrow company. And I like to advise people that if they receive something that has an account number on it, be suspicious. It's probably and it could possibly be a fraudulent person saying direct your deposit here to my account, and then it lands up who knows where and is usually not retrievable. So I just advise you to be very, very clear with clients, to be very, very sure before they initiate any wire that they're sending it where it needs to go, and to be clear about verifying that where they're sending it is the intended destination. I really think we can't overemphasize the importance of that disclosure. All right, now on to the RPA. So something that many of you may know and some of you who are newer may not know is when you're in any of the CAR forms, if you are date prepared, if it's today, if you double click on that field, today's date comes in. If you are actually preparing it today, but you're really not going to be having it signed tomorrow, and you want to select tomorrow as the date prepared, you can use the calendar drop down and do that. So obviously this is going to be an offer from Betty Buyer. And if there are additional buyers, you can add them in. The address of the property. And you can just, sometimes you'll get a drop down, and you can, obviously we're not going to be putting anything or selling anything in Idaho, but if you can use the drop down if the right address comes up on the drop down. You have to put in the county. I frequently see this being omitted. And then the zip code. And don't forget the assessor's parcel number. So that one is frequently also omitted. The bank needs that. They need to know that they're lending on that, the specified parcel is the one they're lending on. So make sure you don't omit that. Now we get down to the purchase price, and let's say the purchase price is $690,000. Offered price is $690,000. Once you put in the numeric value, the written value pops in for you. I mentioned that because I've seen people sit there trying to write it in here. System does it for you. Close of escrow, it's been a little bit shaky. Some things have been taking a little bit longer in this current environment with the restrictions are happening because of COVID. Most common is about 30 days from acceptance. You might want to pad out a little bit, maybe 35 days or 32 or 33 days. But bear in mind that when you get accepted, the buyer's loan gets locked. It can't be locked prior to acceptance. And most loan locks are 30 days in duration. So hopefully, without having to pay an extension fee. So hopefully 30 days, you are working with a lender that can get it done within the 30-day time frame. Because most of the time they want to lock pretty close to immediately after getting an accepted offer. Now, seller's brokerage firm, let's say it's 29 Palms Realty, okay? In that case, they'd be representing the seller, and HomeSmart Realty West would be representing the buyer. If it is a situation where you have found a home that is listed by another HomeSmart Realty West agent, now we are the agent of both the buyer and seller. And notice when you click that in one place, it populates to the other spots. This is agency confirmation, and I'm going to jump up and down on this a little bit because I see this so often where that's omitted, and you must confirm agency when you're presenting an offer. And this is the notice that both seller and buyer are represented by the same company, or in the case of, you have to uncheck that in order to be able to check anything. If it were a different company than seller and buyer. Okay, so we'll just leave it as dual agency for now. The license number of the company that you are submitting the offer to has to be put here. And in our case, it's 01905908. That'll go here as well. But you also have to put in the agent's DRE number. Now, the agent's DRE number is easy because that is, and I'm just going to pick something random here, that is going to be in the MLS. This number, if this is the seller's brokerage, and it is, this will not be in MLS. So what you have to do to get the seller's brokerage number, not the agent, but the brokerage, is you have to go to the DRE website to get this. What I see often is that the number that's in MLS for the broker ID is put in here, and that number is a MLS ID number. It is not the DRE license number of the broker. DRE license numbers are always 8 digits and they start with a 0. So you have to take Amy Agent's number, do a license search on the DRE website, and that will take you to getting the DRE number for the broker. So that is agency confirmation. Extremely important that you have all of that accurate. And avoid the mistake of putting in the MLS ID for the broker, for the listing broker. Okay, so finance terms, we have to have an initial deposit, and that is also called earnest money deposit. The earnest money deposit is going to be in San Diego County. There is a tolerance for less than 3%. You do not want to exceed 3% with the initial deposit. And we'll get to that probably tomorrow when we cover paragraphs 21 and 22, which is liquidated damages, paragraph 21. You don't want to exceed 3% on the initial deposit. There are some counties in California that pretty much demand that you put the full 3% deposit in. San Diego County seems to be somewhat tolerant of smaller deposits, probably because we're a military town, and on VA transactions, there's often not 3% earnest money deposit because a VA loan is a 0 down loan. But let's just say in this case, we have a $690,000 purchase price. Let's just say we're going to offer $15,000 as earnest money initial deposit. Now you may get countered to a full 3% of the purchase price, or maybe not. Again, San Diego County seems to tolerate something a little bit less than 3% for the earnest money deposit. Now, buyers will sometimes think they want to put the least amount down here as possible because they think it's extra money that they're paying for the property. It's not. This applies to their down payment and closing costs at close of escrow. And it is the seller's, the purpose of it is it's the seller's insurance that buyer is not going to default, or if buyer does just flat out default, they will, seller has some recourse for the expenses and inconvenience and everything they've encountered with having the property taken off the market and then having the buyer not close. Now, another question that comes up here with buyers are deathly afraid they're going to lose their earnest money deposit. When we get to paragraph 14, which covers contingencies primarily and inspections and so forth, that clearly states the conditions under which a buyer's earnest money deposit would be at risk. Buyer has contingencies that are part of the purchase contract, and those contingencies cover their inspections and loan primarily. Those are the most common. And unless the buyer removes contingencies in writing, the contingencies continue to run, and buyer can vacate the contract based on any remaining contingency that has not been removed. And when they do, buyer is generally entitled to receive their earnest money back. So if buyer does inspections, finds things that were not knowable at the time of having made the offer, that are not agreeable to the buyer, and they do not want to proceed and close the transaction, buyer can cancel for cause. They don't like the results of their inspection findings. And then in that case, they're entitled to receive their earnest money deposit back. So I'm just covering here, along with how to complete the contract, some of the objections and concerns that you get along the way with buyers, and that is a common one. Two common ones. They think it's extra money they're paying, or they think that somebody's sitting there plotting to steal their earnest money deposit, and that's just not the case. It's held in escrow, which is a neutral third party. So the default, there are several means of conveying the earnest money deposit to escrow. One is cashier's check. That's not too commonly used. Personal check, almost never used anymore. Too many cases of buyer tendering a personal check for the earnest money deposit and having it bounce. The default, however, is directly to the escrow holder by EFT, electronic funds transfer. And that is the most common way. Escrow sends out the wire instructions we talked about a minute ago when we were discussing the wire fraud advisory. They send out the escrow instructions, and the buyer takes them to the bank. The bank, verifies the correct account numbers and so forth with escrow, and then wires the funds. And that's the most common and efficient way to do it. Some people are a little bit skittish about the wire, and they want to do a cashier's check. I've also sometimes had buyers who think that they can set it up like as a bill pay through their bank account, which is an ACH transfer. Escrow will not accept that. It has to be an EFT. The difference is an ACH transfer can be called back by the sender. EFT cannot. Once it clears the Fed, it's deposited, and it cannot be called back by the person who sent it. Okay, so generally speaking, within 3 business days of acceptance, buyer will be submitting their earnest money deposit to escrow. Now, there could be exceptions. Let's say the buyer has to get their money out of 401k, and the 401k holder may not produce funds within 3 days. You could check the other box and just say, see paragraph 6 and put in the other terms in paragraph 6. That buyer will submit the earnest money deposit within a day or whatever the time frame is after receiving the funds from the 401k, if that's going to be the source of their down payment money. Okay. All right. Increased deposit, not usually used, but it could be used. I don't like it when you have somebody's that gets advised by their uncle, give them $1,000 now, and then do your inspections and then give an increased deposit. That's not a good reason for using the increased deposit feature. That's somebody that bought a house 50 years ago somewhere in Nebraska, and that's the way it was done then and there. But really, not many sellers of real property in coastal California are going to take their property off the market for $1,000. But you might have a case where someone wants to get into escrow on your property. Their own personal property is closing in 6 days. All contingencies have been removed. Right now, maybe liquid funds, they have $5,000, and then they want to increase their deposit in 7 days when their escrow closes. That would be a legitimate reason for using the increased deposit feature. One example of a legitimate reason, but most of the time you're going to put that earnest money deposit into escrow within 3 days after acceptance. Now, first loan amount, let's say you were using and I'm going to change this and make this easier math for myself. $700,000 house. So if it were a 20% down conventional, then the loan amount would be 80% of that 700,000. So that would be 140,000 off of 700. Your loan amount would be 560. Okay. If you are, and then let's see what the system does here. We're assuming a conventional financing. 560 is going to be the loan amount with 20% down, and the system does the math for you and calculates the difference between your loan amount plus your earnest money deposit, and that's the balance of funds that the buyer is going to be needing to bring to close. If it is an FHA or a VA, let's do VA first. When you check the VA box, the system puts in a form that is called, it's a required form, and it's FVA, card form FVA, and it's called the FHA VA Amendatory Clause. We'll take a look at that, not immediately, but before long. Now, if it is a VA, you're most likely going to be doing 100% financing. And so a mistake I see people do is saying, well, it's 700,000. And so they're putting $15,000 earnest money deposit. So the loan is 685. No, it's 100% financing. That means the loan is 700,000. So what happens down below when we put in the 700,000? That 15,000 becomes a credit to the buyer. And that just means that's money that would be in escrow that will be available and probably applied to buyers' closing costs. But the VA loan type, though, does allow for buyer to come in with no money at all. In that scenario, you would be having a seller that would be agreeing to pay the buyer's closing costs. And in that case, this amount of money could go back to the buyer at close of escrow. But what usually happens is it's a VA no, which is no down payment, and the VA no is no down payment, no closing costs. But it's not too easy to get sellers to pay closing costs, all of buyers' closing costs. It does happen though, and if you have a buyer that's can afford a house but doesn't have a lot of cash, liquid cash available, one way to get them into a house sometimes is to get those closing costs paid by someone else other than the buyer. Okay. Now, if you were going to do not VA but FHA, the form, that same form that just went into the transaction would go into this. Would be going into the transaction, but it's already there, so it's not going in now. So I'm going to do the math here. For an FHA loan, most of the time, the down payment is 3.5%. Now, in this case, we have to also observe the maximums that are within the county, and FHA and VA, I believe, are still at 690 maximum. So maybe I should go back to 690 as being the maximum purchase, actually maximum loan amount. So actually it's a maximum loan amount. So in this case, on the 700,000, you're going to be 3.5% down means your loan amount is 96.5%, because 3.5% is down payment. 3.5% is down payment. So in that scenario, then the loan amount would be 675,000. On FHA. Okay, so those are the conventional VA and FHA are the most common loan types that we see. There are a few other interesting products, but these are the most common, which is what we're going to stick with today. Additional financing terms. If you were going to ask for seller to pay a portion of buyer's closing costs, Do not put it here. That is not a financing term. That goes in paragraph 6. So, but additional financing terms, what I usually put, which most often the case is, okay, something like buyer is pre-approved. See, lender, her company, whatever her company name is, Lucy's Mortgage. And then I usually put in phone number, and I do that because it's just nice to have it front and center for the listing agent to have a reference in case they would like to call the lender and find out the strength of the buyer, which is a legitimate concern for a listing agent. Okay. So that's just my way of doing it. There's not one and only one right way of doing things. But now we come to
Andrea,
verification. Yes.
before we go to the next page, I've got a couple questions.
Okay.
First question would be, would increased deposit be used to bring the EMD up to 3%, or would it be above and beyond?
Excellent question. You don't want the earnest money deposit to exceed 3%, including any increased deposit.
Great. And the next question is, what if the loan is an ARM?
Oh, you know, I'm glad that this was brought up, because this section of the contract here at 3D talks about loan terms, and there's more than one school of thought on this. But a lot of people will recommend putting in whatever the fixed rate it should not exceed. Right now, 3.5 seems to be easily gettable. Sometimes listing agents, myself included, will counter that out because, and the reason is, remember we talked up here about close of escrow being 30 days for the most part, and also that the buyer's loan lock lasts for 30 days. So the thing is, as a listing agent, you don't have any control whatsoever about when the buyer chooses to lock their loan. So let's say we know right now today, 3.5 is a very gettable, easily obtainable rate at par for most borrowers. We also don't know the specifics about this borrower. This borrower could have quite an interesting credit history that does not qualify them for, you know, the best, most optimum rate. So basically, as a listing agent, if someone puts a figure in here about what the interest rate shall not exceed, I will counter it out, and I will say buyer's loan rate and term shall be best available to buyer at the time buyer chooses to lock buyer's loan. On the other hand, a lot of people will recommend putting this in and, you know, and attempting to get an agreement on that, especially if the buyer is very close in their qualifying, and if something were to happen, they would not be able to qualify above 3.5%. And we don't know how long it's going to take the seller to respond. We don't know how long, you know, what can happen. We had one case about a month or a little over a month ago where the buyer had 3.25 at par for a VA loan, and the seller fooled around trying to, I think the listing agent was trying to sell it themselves, and they kept fooling around, not responding. Well, then COVID happened, and 9 days later, when the seller finally accepted the offer, the 3.25 interest rate cost would have cost $35,000 to obtain. It's like mind-boggling. Because a whole bunch of points were added on. It was an extraordinarily, it was ridiculous amount. And then that changed over time, but it's a good idea to go ahead and put in a rate that's, you know, that's a reasonable rate for whatever the time frame is that you're submitting the offer. And that varies, as we know, from day to day. Now, if they're doing not a fixed rate, but an adjustable rate, you're going to put, check that if they're using an adjustable rate loan. And then a not to exceed percentage is advisable there, because adjustables can be a whole lot of different formats. Anyway, you may get countered on whatever you put in here. You may not. I hope that answered the question.
And we've got a follow-up, another one. Can the buyer use a different lender for loan from the one whom he got his pre-approval?
That is an excellent question. Yes, and we'll get to paragraph K, which is buyer 3K, which is buyer stated financing. What you can't do is, and I'm really glad you brought this up, the down payment is not a contingency of the agreement. So you have to have the down payment funds, and you have to use the scenario, the loan scenario that you put forth in your offer, unless you have a written agreement from the seller to change it. So you can use this FHA loan with, and you've gotten pre-approved with Lucy's mortgage, but then you talk to Larry's mortgage and find out Larry, you just like Larry better, the buyer feels more comfortable with them, feels whatever they feel, more knowledgeable, or maybe Larry has a nice little niche loan program that really suits their needs or whatever. They can switch to a different mortgage company. Then they would just send an updated lender letter from the other lender that was going to be doing the loan. But you can't change the terms. You can't come in and represent that you're doing a 20% down conventional and then just say, oh, just kidding, we're actually going to do FHA. Or just kidding, we've decided to use our VA loan. So if you were going to do that, you would have to have written agreement, and we'll get to that in just a minute in paragraph 3K.
Okay, one more. Where to put seller agrees to pay for buyer's recurring or non-recurring closing costs?
Not in paragraph 3E, because it is not a financing term. That would go in other terms, which is paragraph 6.
All right. Thank you very much. Proceed.
All right, upward and onward. Okay, so now paragraph 3H is verification of down payment and closing costs. Most of the time you're going to want to have verification attached. Now, if it's cash, it would be, you'd be checking all cash offer up here. And then that tells you that they're attaching the verification to the offer, but if in a case where you're using a loan and you're in our marketplace, the amount of down payment is and closing costs is substantial, it's significant. So even on a low down loan like a FHA, you're going to be wanting to attach verification that yes, we do in fact have the money. Certainly on something like the 20% down conventional, where 140,000 was going to be the down payment, you need to demonstrate that you have that. So the couple ways that can occur, the buyer can submit a statement from a financial institution that shows that they have the funds. The statement has to be drawn on a United States financial institution, which may sound obvious, but I have received POF, proof of funds, in Japanese yen one time back in the day. So it has to be on a United States financial institution, and it has to be in the name of one of the buyers, at least one of the buyers that's on the contract. And it has to show sufficient funds for covering the down payment and closing costs that are represented in our financing scenario on page 1. Now, it can be a financial statement like that. If it is a buyer's financial statement, you want to make sure and ask the buyer to redact the account numbers prior to sending to you, if possible. If they don't redact them before sending to you, then you must Sharpie them out with the deepest, darkest Sharpie and make sure that the account numbers are not conveyed to the other side. Another way that is sometimes acceptable for verifying funds is if you have a good lender who has gotten the buyer pre-approved and has verified all of the assets of the buyer. sometimes a well-worded lender letter will suffice for this purpose, where the lender is verifying that they themselves have verified these assets and have verified their existence in liquid form for the transaction. Okay, so next is the appraisal, contingency, and removal. If you're using a loan, you're going to be contingent on the appraisal coming in at the agreed upon price. Now, what happens if it doesn't? If it's a cash deal, some cash buyers want to leave this open, but I personally have never had a cash buyer who actually got an appraisal. And so if it's a cash buyer, then you could say it's not contingent on a written appraisal. And if you're in competition, even if you're the cash buyer, it's probably a good idea to take the appraisal contingency out to strengthen your offer. But if, let's say, you have a house, 700,000, you have the appraisal done and it comes in at 715. Well, the appraisal is the property of the buyer. You, as the agent, lender, will probably let you know where it came in. But if it comes in over your contract price, keep your lip zipped. Do not reveal this information to anyone. And the reason for that is the appraiser is going to appraise within a range that of what the values could be. It's not the price of the house. The market really determines the price of the house. The appraiser has to find comparable sales that support the value ready, willing, and able buyers are willing to pay for the house. So let's say it doesn't come in high, but it comes in low. Let's say it comes in not at 750, but at 685. Well, the appraisal is going to be, the buyer's loan is going to be based on the lower of the contract price or the appraised value. So even in the case where the appraisal came in higher than the contract price, buyer's loan is still going to be based on the contract price. And in the case where the appraisal came in lower, it is going, the loan amount will be based on the lower of the two items, in this case, the appraisal. What happens then with that gap? What's going to have to happen is either the seller will have to agree to come down to the appraised value. They may not be too happy about that. Buyer is going to have to agree to bring in the additional cash to fill the gap, or maybe they meet somewhere in the middle. So those are the three things that can happen when the appraisal does not come in on contract price. You'll notice over time in your practice, if you're newer and just getting started out, most of the time the appraisal comes in on the contract price. Why is that? No, it's not rigged, but again, a property value from the standpoint of an appraiser, there's a range that it could be, and the appraiser doesn't really want to be part of the transaction. So as long as the contract price is within the range of the value of the property, they will probably bring the appraisal in on contract price. So loan terms, loan applications. This just tells us that within 3 days after acceptance, buyer will deliver a letter and apply for the loan and all that. Well, it doesn't really happen that way in actual practice. Before you're submitting an offer, you better have your buyer pre-approved, because you've got to attach a lender, hopefully pre-approval letter. A pre-qual letter, pre-qualification letter is simply, it might as well say, I talked to the buyers, they seemed like nice people, and I believe what they said, because nothing has really been verified on a pre-qual letter. Pre-approval, and there's different levels of pre-approval. I prefer the fully underwritten pre-approval, which means the lender has taken the whole buyer package, sent that through underwriting, and shaken any skeletons out of the closet, and they're ready to go. They're not going to come up on any unexpected and unfortunate things down the line when you think you're getting ready to close, and all of a sudden you find out that the buyer has a child support lien or something like that. So you're going to attach a lender letter hopefully a pre-approval letter, and hopefully a fully underwritten pre-approval letter. So always check that box and check this box, because you're going to be verifying the funds either by submitting the buyer proof of funds on a buyer account, or because the lender worded their lender letter in a way that was acceptable to the seller and listing agent, verifying that they'd verified those things. And if it's a loan, you got to have a lender letter. So, all right. So loan contingency removal, the default is 21 days. It really is taking about that long in most cases, not all cases. It depends again on the caliber of the lender that you're using in the transaction. So within 21 days after acceptance, buyer will remove in writing. Again, here you go, in writing. Those contingencies have to be removed in writing, or they continue to run, or cancel the agreement. And if there is an appraisal contingency, removal of the loan contingency shall be deemed also removal of the appraisal contingency. If there's no loan contingency, it really better be a cash deal, or a buyer who says they'll buy it one way or the other, whether or not the appraisal comes in, whether or not they get their loan. If they want to use a loan, but if they don't get the loan, they're still going to buy it with cash. But I don't recommend checking no loan contingency to strengthen the offer, or to appear to strengthen the offer, when you are using a loan, because you are putting the buyer's earnest money deposit at risk. If something were to happen, they were to lose employment, something were to happen with COVID, or forget COVID, just anything would happen that they weren't able to get the loan, you can kiss their earnest money deposit goodbye. So only use that if it's a buyer, a cash buyer, or a buyer who says, you know, what I just said, I'd like to use a loan, but I'm going to buy it anyway. If for some reason I can't get my loan. This advisory here in paragraph 5 is, or J5, is lender limits on buyer credits. So we will get to paragraph 6 here shortly, where we're going to talk about how to phrase the request for closing cost credit. But you can't just willy-nilly pick any number. You have to check with your lender and ask how much is allowable for buyer credit. Buyer closing costs rarely exceed 3% anyway, and usually are less than 3%. So just make sure with the lender that you're not putting in a request for more credits than are going to be allowed by the lender. Paragraph 3K, we talked about a minute ago, buyer stated financing, and this just simply says sellers relying on buyer's representation of the type of financing specified, including but not limited to all cash, amount of down payment, contingent or non-contingent loan. Seller has agreed to specific closing date, purchase price, and to sell to buyer in reliance on buyer's covenant concerning financing. And buyer shall pursue the financing specified in this agreement. Seller has no obligation to cooperate with buyer's effort to obtain any financing other than that specified in the agreement on page 1. And the availability of any such alternate financing does not excuse buyer from the obligation to purchase the property and close escrow as specified in the agreement. So again, you can switch from one lender to the other. If you are switching loan types entirely, then you have to have seller's written agreement and written consent to say, okay, we're going from a 20% down conventional to maybe a 10% down conventional, or whatever the case may be. You can't just throw out bait that looks like a real attractive loan and then switch it up without everybody being in agreement. And that would be written agreement. Now, if the buyer needs to sell a property that they currently own in order to buy this property, you would be using the car form COP, which again, when you check the box, flies into the transaction for you. And that is a contingency for the sale of other property. We're not going to delve into that right now, but that's what you would do if they have to sell in order to buy, or want to sell in order to buy. All right, these are addenda and advisories that may be appended to the contract. If you're in a rural area like Fallbrook or Bonsall, you're most likely, even parts of Vista, you're most likely going to be using the septic, well, and property monument addendum, CAR form SWPI. That's a fairly involved form covering who handles what with septic, well testing, and defining the property, exact property lines. If you are submitting an offer that is, going in that they just accepted another offer, but your buyer loves this house and they want to be in backup position in case anything goes awry with the first position offer, you would use the backup offer addendum. If it's a short sale, the short sale addendum. If it's a bank-owned property, you're going to use the REO advisory. You always have the buyer's inspection advisory. That's essentially page 11 of the residential purchase agreement. And then one thing that you really ought to do when you are checking, getting ready to prepare the offer, is you ought to pull up the property profile and see who the seller is. Often in our area, the property is held in a trust. In that case, you're going to put the trust advisory into the form, and the seller is actually the trust in that scenario. There's a form you use to tie the signer to the trust. We'll get to that later. Okay, other terms. This is where you would put in, let's say you have a VA buyer or even an FHA buyer who wants some help with closing costs. You just put seller shall pay whatever the figure is. It can usually a dollar figure. I don't like up to numbers. I like definite numbers. So let's say seller shall pay $7,000. And I'm, so I would type it down. For buyers, recurring and non-recurring closing costs, close of escrow. Okay, so what are recurring closing costs? Recurring closing costs are things like the prepaid, what they also refer to as prepaid. And these are things that are payable every year. If you have less than a 20% down conventional loan, you're going to have an impound account, which is also sometimes called an escrow account. And the lender collects upfront a certain number of months of taxes, a couple of months of homeowners insurance. If there's flood insurance, a couple of months of flood insurance to place in the impound account. And then what happens is over the course of the year, and each of the 12 payments the buyer is making, they're also paying a portion of what are the projected property taxes and insurance costs. So that impound account has to be funded up front. So those would be your recurring closing costs, the things that are going to be payable every year. Non-recurring would be things that are simply transaction related, like your escrow fee or your lender's title insurance fee. That would be a buyer cost. The cost of obtaining the loan. Those things are happening just once, so those are non-recurring. The lenders want to see when there's a credit request for buyer closing costs to include both, so that it can be applied as needed. Now, getting into allocation of costs. This another thing that has come up recently that it would be is something. Let's say you are handling the purchase for your aunt, and your aunt has been a real estate agent in the past, still holds a real estate license, but is not an active real estate licensee. You would say buyer Betty buyer is a California real estate licensee. And if they're not in active practice, you could add not currently in active practice. If they are, maybe you're handling it for your aunt who does commercial, and she is an inactive practice, you would probably say inactive commercial real estate. But if one of the principals is a licensee, it needs to be disclosed and it needs to be in the contract. So those are just a couple of examples of things that might go in other terms of a myriad of possibilities. Okay, inspections, reports, and certificates, and starting on allocation of costs here, paragraph 7. This first part, 7A, deals with reports. It specifically says, this does not determine who is to pay for any work recommended or identified in the report. Okay, so first one, I don't think I've ever seen anything but Cellar checked there, and this is for the natural hazard zone disclosure report. This is a required disclosure in California, and it's a report that's produced by a third party. Cellar is required by law to provide this disclosure, so it almost ends up being Cellar paid. It's about $100, and there are a number of companies that are providers. I'm going to just say this: whoever you choose to do the report, always check the environmental box. Now, in years past, we would put here and put the clue report, which is a comprehensive, it's a underwriting, insurance underwriting report that shows any claims that have been made on the property in the last 5 years. That is no longer available to be provided by the natural hazard disclosure companies. So don't put that there. If you have done that in the past, don't do it anymore. That ability has been taken away from the natural hazard companies. Now, prepared by, you could put a number of things here. You could put buyer's choice. You could put seller's choice, which is a common thing to be put in. If you have I will say all natural hazard disclosure reports are not created equal. I have my preferences. I like Disclosure Source. I like First American. So if you like Disclosure Source, you could check that. Or if you have one you want to specify, First American, NHD. Type in, you might get countered on that. Maybe not. The one thing that does commonly happen though, when you get the NHD report, well, Cellar is going to be ordering this after escrow is opened. You're going to have to check two things. Make sure that if you checked environmental, that they did in fact include the environmental portion of the report. And if you specified First American, that it is ordered from First American. A lot of times they just have their set routine that they do, the listing agent, and they just order it from whomever they normally order it from without checking what they agreed to do in the contract. Or if they have one place they always order it from, they may counter you on that. Again, not all NHDs are created equal, but is it really the hill you want to die on? Probably not. So if you get countered on it, you're probably going to be agreeing to whatever they provide. So now another report that is commonly used in transactions is structural pest report. Also called termite report, also commonly called wood destroying organisms report. Whatever you put in there is, this is the report only. So do not put your request for clearance here. This is, again, reports. does not determine who is to pay for any work. Okay, this is not where you put your clearance request. Now, the only loan type that requires that you put the structural pest report to be paid by the seller in the contract is the VA loan. It is also the only loan type that requires a structural pest clearance. Now, it may be Section 1, or depending on the VA underwriter, it might be Section 1 and Section 2 that is required to be cleared. But again, here you're going to put your request for your report. You might want to put buyer's choice, or the seller may say, we already had a pest report done and we had it done by Major League. So that's what we're going to be providing. If you know that, you can type it into the contract, or you can just put seller's choice there. I personally, when it's not a VA loan that absolutely requires a VA lending guidelines specify that the buyer cannot pay for the pest report. So when it's going to be a VA loan, that's when I'm going to put it in there. There are also a lot of cases if you don't have to put it in on a conventional loan or even an FHA loan, and it can become problematic. I prefer personally to, in those scenarios, if it's FHA or conventional, to have it be part of the buyer's inspection period. And nothing I say is universal. There's cases you definitely want that pest report and you definitely want the clearance, and you know that going in. It could be buyer's comfort level. It could be you can see obvious wood damage, you know, on siding or wood trim or whatever, and you know that you want a structural pest clearance. So it's not, I'm not going to universally say that you're not going to ask for a pest report. It's very, very common to be asking for it. If you're in a condo, it's helpful to know what is homeowners association responsibility and what is individual homeowner responsibility. Most of the time, but not all the time, in condos, the homeowners association covers the pest control work that needs to be done on building exteriors. That is not 100% of the case though. So know kind of, if you can, know where you are. Again, there are cases where you won't be putting the pest report in the contract and cases where you will. But let's say you have put it in. Who's it going to be prepared by? Again, let's just say seller choice. I have several reasons why I prefer for it to be buyer choice. But again, one thing that commonly gets countered is that they say seller to select all services, which is not, I don't consider that to be well advised, but it's common. Okay, now.
Can we pause again for a couple questions?
You can, yes.
First, how did you arrive at the $7,000 in other terms?
Oh, I would have asked the lender, we have a $700,000 loan. I would have asked the lender what they think, I mean, a $700,000 purchase price. I would have asked the lender what they think the buyer needs or requires to have contributed by someone else other than buyer funds that are available to pay closing costs. So again, we want it to be less than 3%. Seldom are you going to see them go as high as 3%. So I would ask the lender, you know, about where do you think their closing costs are going to fall. The lender they can produce an estimate for you. And so maybe they need some help from the seller and they have some of their own funds, or maybe lender is going to be able to provide a certain amount of credit for the buyer's closing costs. So it's going to be situational every time, figuring out what you need to request. But maybe it's just they flat out don't have the money and flat out can't buy it if they don't get this credit, you know, so it'll vary. Yeah.
Okay, and what are Section 1 and Section 2, please?
Okay, good question. Section 1 in structural pest terms is things that are currently wrong with the property. So this is wood destroying organisms, and this would be dry rot, fungus. Those things are organisms caused by organisms that are eating away and compromising the integrity of the wood members. Could be bugs, termites, powder post beetles. So those are things that are actively currently in play on the property with damaged wood. The Section 2 is something that's going to lead over time to a Section 1 issue. For instance, let's say you have a fence post that's in the ground and it's right next to the wood siding, and it has earth to wood contact, which means that constantly the moisture in the soil is getting into that wood, which over time will break down the wood, cause the wood to break down, and then give the termites a little highway to burrow up in there, eat up the wood there on the fence post, and then make their little tunnels over to the actual structure, the wood siding. So that would be Section 2. We see that fence post is sitting on the dirt, the dirt gets moisture from, the property being, the plants being watered, et cetera, or rain or whatever. And so we see that it's sitting there. We don't see that fence post right now is dry rotted, but we see that it's probably not going to be too long until it is. So that's a Section 2. Okay. Section 2 is going to lead to a Section 1 condition at some point.
Well, good.
Okay. So government retrofits, we're going to always check here. Seller shall pay for smoke alarm and carbon monoxide device installation and water heater bracing if required by law, and it is, prior to close of escrow. Seller shall provide buyer written statements of compliance in accordance with state and local law, unless seller is exempt. There are a few exempt sellers, but for the water heater bracing and smoke detector and carbon monoxide detector, you want those in place and installed. You don't want them, and I just encountered this, hadn't encountered this in a long time, but within the last week or so, a listing agent actually said, oh, they were just going to throw the carbon monoxide detector and smoke detector on the kitchen table. It has to be installed, and the reason is the appraiser is going to take photos of those items installed. It's a required part of their appraisal, and so they have to be installed, not sitting in their package on the table or on the counter. So even though it says that here, we're going to cover that again down in paragraph 778. Okay, now the other two things that cover the government compliance, and these are frequently counted out, but you still may want to check them. And these are for seller to pay for the cost of compliance with any other minimum mandatory government inspections and reports, if required as a condition of closing escrow under any law. Example of this might be in the city of San Diego. There is a requirement for a water cert, which certifies that the property has the low flow shower heads and low flow toilets and so forth, the water conserving fixtures. So you're going to want to have that, you will check that box, and you want the seller to provide you with that certification. If the property does not have the updated low flow plumbing fixtures, and buyer is going to be remodeling as soon as they close escrow anyway, there is a workaround here in the city of San Diego that allows the escrow to go ahead and close. Buyer signs the waiver and certifies that within 90 days after close, they will have the low flow plumbing fixtures in place. Often though, you'll see the listing agents will counter this out, and also this. request for seller shall pay for the cost of compliance with any other minimum mandatory government retrofit standards required as a condition of closing escrow under any law. So I generally check them, but you will often see that listing agents advise the seller to reject those. So you may get countered on those. Now, escrow and title. Southern California, escrow and title are separate, and each principal has their own escrow fee. You will see them saying split 50-50. You'll see that on offers. Don't agree to that. You need to counter each shall pay their escrow escrow-related fees. Why is that? Split 50-50 would mean that both buyers and sellers' escrow fees are split 50-50 between both buyer and seller. Why is that important? Well, often when buyers are using loans, there's certain endorsements and things like that buyer has to pay that are not seller escrow fees. So it usually is if there are those kinds of things, they would fall on the buyer side, and that's why you need to say they're each going to pay their own. And if you are a listing agent and you receive an offer that has that split 50-50 option, counter it back to this. Each shall pay their own escrow related fees. Escrow holders shall be, now you may have had a conversation with the listing agent, and if they're a HomeSmart agent, they may be using our in-house escrow company, which we have excellent escrow officers, Connie Snyder and Angela Harmon. Angela is actually, it's Smart Escrow, which is in the process of being changed over to Power Escrow. But anyway, long story short, you can specify who you want for escrow, but most of the time that is going to be seller, it'll end up being seller choice. And if I try and have a conversation with the listing agent and ask who they like for title and escrow, people get really attached to working with the person that they love working with, especially their escrow officer. Okay, so most of the time you'll see it like that, but you can try. You could put who you would like. You could put Power Escrow or seller choice. And sometimes you'll get an out of area listing agent who says just pick escrow. So then you get to make the choice, but often it's going to be seller. We want seller to pay for the owner's title insurance policy, and the law actually says buyer is entitled to choose because it's insurance that covers the buyer, but in actual practice it doesn't play out that way. In actual practice it's almost always going to be seller choice. I personally like the big title companies, not the little not the small ones. That's my personal bias, and that's from having gone through meltdown 2007 when the small title companies went up in smoke. Well, then who covers those policies versus First American, who's been around forever, Chicago Title, and Fidelity. Those three major companies underwrite all the little ones anyway. Again, it's most often, though, going to be seller choice, and there could be legitimate reasons. Let's say they had Ticor, and there was a lot of title work that had to be done on the property prior to getting it put on the market. They legitimately are going to want to have title Ticor. Okay, and most of the time, again, seller is going to be the one who chooses these. County transfer tax, that is almost always seller paid. I don't think I've ever done a transaction where it was any different. But if you are going to be checking buyer and seller, then you would say probably split 50-50. But again, I never see pushback on who's paying the county transfer tax. Or having seller be the one to pay county transfer tax. The amount is $1.10 per $1,000 of sale price. So on a $700,000 house, it would be $770. The escrow, of course, is going to calculate that. This is in California Civil Code, the amount, and it's the same in every county in the state. Now, city transfer tax, interestingly, in the 18 incorporated cities in the county of San Diego, I don't know of any cities that charge a city transfer tax. But again, know where you are. If you're up in Riverside County, you might want to call an escrow officer up there and say, you know, before, as you're writing the contract, and say, is there a city transfer tax? I'm in Temecula or wherever you are, Murrieta. Find out if there's a city transfer tax, and if so, what the rate is. For instance, Sacramento County, it's $2.75 per thousand of sale price, so it's a higher cost than the county transfer tax. There are Bay Area counties where it's as much as $15 per thousand. So it's really a significant figure. So know where you are. And if you don't have it where you are, you don't need to check anything because it's not applicable. Or if you're not sure, you could say Cellar and then put if applicable. If you're not able to get all the facts about where, you know, at the time you're writing offer, that's something you can do so you can proceed. The seller shall pay homeowners insurance, HOA transfer fee. Most often that's not going to be an issue. The seller will agree to pay for that. They are also in paragraph 4 here, there's required by California Civil Code to provide certain documents that are required to be delivered to the buyer by Civil Code. So that there's not even an option. That's going to be seller paid. That's Civil Code. And then usually, if it's in an HOA, seller shall pay for HOA fees for preparing all of the documents other than those required by Civil Code. And those are things that are going to be prepared by the HOA management company, and there's always a fee for it. And boy, have I seen those fees go up and up and up over the years. That's a seller paid fee. If you're representing a seller, you need to advise them that they'll have to be getting that outside of escrow. It can't be paid in escrow because the management companies won't produce the documents without payment. So prepare the seller that they will be paying for that once we get an accepted contract, and that they will have to pay for it up front, credit card or something. So, you know, some other means, but it cannot come out of the funds because it has to be provided to the buyer prior to close of escrow. Can't come out of their closing funds or closing proceeds. Okay, so the buyer will pay for any HOA certification fee, and this is a lender fee when the buyer's purchasing in an HOA. The lender requires to have an HOA cert, and there's a fee for that, which is a buyer paid. Most places don't have a private transfer fee. Some do. If you don't know where you are, you could again ask seller and then do the if applicable thing. But most of the time, it's not too common to encounter, but if you encounter it, some of them are as high as 6%. So you want to know for sure if you are in an area where there's a private transfer fee. Now, G8, remember back in 7A or 7B, we asked for, I'm sorry, 7A, we asked for the structural pest report, and now we want to here check the seller and ask for seller shall pay for structural pest clearance, which would of course include both the repairs necessary to obtain the clearance and the clearance report itself. And I always recommend putting this in: seller shall pay for CO, carbon monoxide, and smoke detector and water heater. prior to the appraisal. Why do I do that? Put it, you know, it's already stated further up here that they would, you know, pay for it, but it already says it here. But we want it done prior to the appraisal, which it isn't stated up here, because if those items are not in place at the time the appraisal is done, the appraiser is going to have to do a go back. And the go back, there's a cost to it. It's about $150 to $200 is what I've generally seen when there's a go back, and it delays things. Now the appraiser has to come back out. It could delay your transaction, you know, 4 or 5 days because the appraiser has to reschedule coming back out to the property and take pictures of those items installed and or water heater braced and strapped. So I think it's really important to put it in here and to specify not only are you going to do it, but you're going to do it prior to the appraisal. And if you don't, because you agreed to do it prior to the appraisal, guess who gets to pay for the go back? You do, seller. You know, so anyway, I think that's an important addition to the contract. Now, seller shall pay. Oh, one thing I don't like to see, I'm going back up here, and sometimes I do see it. People will check buyer shall pay for the following report: whole house inspection or home inspection. I do not recommend putting that in the contract. Why? Because anything you call out and specify in red flag in the contract, the underwriter for the buyer's loan can require, and usually will require, to see it. And now the underwriter may start calling out repairs that they're going to require to be done prior to closing escrow or prior to allowing the loan to be funded. And so it's not necessary. Buyer has their inspection rights. Don't flag it and flag it out as something that an underwriter can call for, and you know, a cranky underwriter with you know, a migraine that day calling out all kinds of repairs that buyer wants to take them on after close of escrow. They don't want it to be, buyer's going to remodel that anyway. We don't want, you know, and seller's going to decline to do them, and then that's the hill you die on. So don't put buyer inspection report up there. Know that the buyer will get it, they have the right to do it, but don't flag it. Now, coming along 7D10, which is our home warranty, almost always the seller will pay your cost not to exceed. You need to know what your property features are. Let's say you have a pool with this property, and the covering pool equipment is more than just basic cost. So you're probably going to want at least, let's say, maybe $750 toward a standard. And this again says the cost is a not to exceed. So if you don't check all the boxes of the coverages you want and the types of coverages, they could get the most basic home warranty for $400 and not give you upgraded if you don't check the box. So check that box always. The home warranty people say always check that. And if the property has air conditioning, you need to check this, or the air conditioning, you won't get a home warranty that covers the air conditioner. If it has a pool or spa, check the box. Now, the other thing, let's say it doesn't have air conditioning or pool and spa, but you know you're going to ask down here for the refrigerator and washer and dryer, and home warranty companies do offer coverage for those items. So something that you can put in here is buyer, don't use the word to, shall select options. What does this do? This means now your cost not to exceed, it's going to be upgraded for sure, and buyer shall select options up to this figure. But again, if it has AC, check it. The basic plan does not cover air conditioning. It covers heating, but not air conditioning. Now, buyer waives the purchase of a home warranty plan. Let's say this house is a total remodel. There's not going to be an appliance left in there. Buyer's probably going to redo most of the plumbing and have the electrical reworked, et cetera, et cetera. And they they don't want the home warranty, check it. If you're not asking for a home warranty here, be sure you check the buyer is waiving the home warranty box. So now we're coming to paragraph 8, items included and excluded from the sale. I always, anything that's a fixture, ceiling fans, window coverings that are affixed to the property, floor coverings, all of these things are fixtures of the property and considered to be conveying with the property. A stove may or may not be. It might be a drop-in range rather than a built-in range. It is a minimum property standard item, so you do have to have a stove in order to get your loan, generally speaking. I mean, I've seen exceptions, but most of the time you're going to have that required. I always check the stoves. If the buyer likes the refrigerator and the washer and dryer that are there and wants to request them, you can check those boxes. And then if there's extra money in this $750, maybe the buyer selects the refrigerator coverage as one of the options, or washer and dryer, or both. Okay. Now, if you are requesting refrigerator and washer and dryer to be included, it's good to be specific. We've had cases where the seller agreed to convey the refrigerator, which was a nice counter depth, probably $3,500, really nice refrigerator. And when the buyer goes to take possession, the rusty old white garage refrigerator has been moved and the good refrigerator has been taken. So it's good to be specific and just say, whatever it is, Samsung refrigerator currently installed. And same with washer and dryer. I mean, you can be as anal as, take pictures of the model number on the inside of the door. Most of the time when you're at the property, you're not thinking to do this, but just remain mindful that if they're going to ask for that, it's really good to be specific so you don't get, the rusty garage refrigerator or the broken down washer and dryer that weren't the ones that were installed at the time you were looking at the property. And if you don't know the model, the make of it, you can just say refrigerator and washer and dryer currently installed at the property. Okay. This talks about, then in paragraph 4, integrated phone and home automation systems, internet, all those things that have all those remote controls. They are considered to be included in the sale unless this is checked. Leased or liened items, the seller will be disclosing if any of the items that are appearing to be fixtures, like solar or a water softener, for example, are actually leased or there's money owed on them. So seller needs to disclose that if it's a lien that's not going to be paid off in close of escrow and something that the buyer is being expected to assume. Excluded from the sale. Again, all the fixtures are included, but unless otherwise specified, the following items are excluded from the sale: audio and video components such as flat screen TVs, speakers, or other items. Why is this important? Because a flat screen TV is mounted on brackets that are, generally speaking, going to be affixed to the property. And so there have been obviously disputes and lawsuits about people taking those items. So again, the contract now clarifies that they are considered to be excluded if any such item itself is not attached to the property, even if a bracket or other mechanism attached to the component is attached to the property. And then furniture or other items that are secured to the property for earthquake purposes yes, they're secured to the property, but they're considered personal property items as well. Now, this is important. If you want, most people would like to take the brackets because they're tend to be specific to the flat screen TV, for instance, that they came with, and they're not cheap if you have to replace them. So I think it's a good thing to you don't, and the buyer, those brackets, unless that buyer has exactly that TV and was going to put it in exactly that spot, the brackets are not of any use to the buyer. So I think it's a good idea to go ahead and check that will be removed and the holes or other damage shall be repaired, but not paint, generally not painted. Some sellers will actually do the repair and paint. Just depends on the nature of the person. Closing in possession. If the buyer intends to occupy the property as buyer's property, primary residence, that is the default. If it's going to be an investment purchase, you would be checking that box. Bear in mind, in investment purchase, you're not going to be using a VA loan or an FHA loan on an investment purchase. Those are homeowner occupied loans only. And if you're doing an investment purchase for a conventional buyer, most of the time it's going to be more than a larger down payment. And you're not going to be able to do an investment property, non-owner property for a low or minimum down payment, even on a conventional loan. So that would be something to check with your lender. Possession is going to be delivered to the buyer, generally speaking, 6 p.m. on the date of close of escrow. You could change that to something else if you wanted to, but the reason it's at 6 p.m. is often by the time the recorder closes at 5 and the escrow and or title company has received confirmation that recordation occurred, it could be at 6 p.m. before you have the confirmation that of recordation. So that's the default. But there might be reasons to change the time frame. Let's say, you know, you've already been told the seller will be out 3 days before close of escrow, in which case you might say, you know, you want possession earlier. But generally speaking, I almost always leave it at the default. It could also be, let's say you have a listing agent who's told you that the seller, you know, one important thing to the seller is they don't have funds to move until escrow closes. And so no later than maybe 3 calendar days after close of escrow. In that scenario, then you're going to be doing, if you were doing that, letting seller stay for any amount of time after close of escrow, here at paragraph 5, you would be checking for an addendum, the SIP, which is car form seller in possession. And that is for possession after close of escrow of up to 29 days, up to and through, including 29 days. If seller possession were to exceed on an owner occupied purchase, if it were to exceed be 30 days or more, you have to use the car form RLAS, which is residential lease after sale, which is a 6-page, really involved form. So if seller needs possession after close of escrow for a valid reason, try and keep it 29 days or less. Okay. All right. And then again, if you're going to be after after close of escrow, you're going to make sure and put in whatever your time is. Okay. And you could also, I guess, use a date. Date is another possibility. Okay. All right. Is there questions, Miss Kelly? No.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself.
Okay.
It looks like Jeannie answered most of them. Let's see, are we still doing the COVID addendum, the CBA?
Yes, and again, not everybody's doing it in every case, but And I am seeing that when it is included, that oftentimes about half the time it's getting counted out by the listing side, but that's where you would put it if you were doing the car form CBA.
And that's it so far. Jeannie answered the rest.
Okay. All right. Again, seller remaining in possession after close of escrow. If seller has the right to remain in possession after close of escrow, parties are advised to sign a separate agreement such as, and you can check that here as well, and then it's going to throw the form into the transaction for you so you don't forget it. And then this is for seller continued occupancy of less than 30 days, again, 29 days or less. And if you are using the, for 30 days or more, our LAS would be the form that you would use. Bear in mind, on an owner-occupied purchase, the buyer's lender wants the buyer in possession of the property within the specified time frame, which is, they don't usually go over 60 days. Otherwise, they're going to assume you made an owner-occupied purchase and got the more favorable down payment and more favorable loan terms that you get with an owner-occupied purchase, but you really purchased it as an investment property, and that's lender fraud. So again, most of the time, seller's going to need to be, or buyer's going to need to be in possession of the property on an owner-occ purchase within 60 days. So if it's a tenant occupied property and the property is being purchased as an owner occupant, then you need to specify when the tenant will be vacating. The default is at least 5 days prior to close of escrow. On an owner-occ purchase, it would be a very slippery slope to accept the property and go ahead and close with tenant in place. But if it's on a investment property and this tenant wants to continue and the buyer is amenable to keeping that tenant, then you would check the tenant to remain in possession. Chapter 10 talks about statutory and other disclosures that buyer will be getting during the course of the escrow. And the statutory ones are generally not optional. Lead-based paint and Mello-Roos and the real estate transfer disclosure statement. We do have a disclosures webinar scheduled for, I think it's July 1. Is that correct, Kelly? Anyway,
yes, July 1st.
Okay. All right. So we'll be covering the disclosures in much more detail then. This says, note to buyer and seller, waiver of statutory and lead disclosures is prohibited. So they have to be conveyed. All right, natural and environmental hazards that we talked about, the NAD report, who's going to pay for it and what you should include in terms of, I think it's really important to always include the environmental section, even when you're in a city subdivision and you think that it's not applicable, you'll be surprised how often it is. Section C here, paragraph C, talks about withholding taxes, and that is the FERPTA disclosures. We'll cover those again on the disclosure day, but these are just taxes that are required to be withheld from the proceeds, the sale proceeds, if the seller is a foreign person and not a U.S. taxpayer, shall we say. Okay. Again, some of the other disclosures that we get during the course of the transaction once we have an accepted offer.
I've got a couple questions. One popped up right after we answered the previous. So why is the CBA being countered out by sellers?
I don't know. I got got one very, very wordy one. Seller has no intention of retaining buyer's deposit, and yada yada yada. It was I think they think there's uncertainty to it, and what the CBA does is it just says if there's unforeseen circumstances that occur due to COVID, like someone who is employed, well employed, expecting to continue to be well employed, but suddenly gets an unexpected ink slip or furlough. And if they remove contingencies, then what are they supposed to do? This is no fault of the buyer. It certainly isn't a buyer default scenario. They just had this unfortunate thing happen. So I don't know why. I don't think I wouldn't counter it out as a listing agent, but I think because it's new and unfamiliar, some people just don't want to deal with it. This is an unprecedented situation that we're in with this pandemic. So, and they don't want the seller to necessarily be potentially the one to bear the brunt of any eventualities that could occur, unforeseen circumstances.
Okay, that's it.
Okay. All right. This talks about condominium and plan development disclosures. These are the HOA documents, and this says that seller has 7 days after acceptance to disclose to buyer properties condominium are located in a planned unit development. Okay, you usually know when you are. And then seller has 3 days to request from the HOA the documents that we specified in earlier paragraphs, paragraph 7. That doesn't mean that the documents are necessarily going to be produced by the management company within the specified time frame. We always hope that they will be, but they sometimes the management companies don't cough them up with their sense of urgency is not great. The management companies, they don't really care about our escrow timeframes. They just get around to it when they get around to it. Some are very cooperative and helpful, some are not. So this just says, seller, you got to at least order them within 3 days after acceptance. Hopefully they come within that time frame. Now, property condition in paragraph 11, this just says that unless otherwise agreed in writing, property is sold in its as-is condition. There's no guarantee of any repairs to be made. Buyer is making buyer inspections so that buyer is making an informed purchase decision, but there are no repairs that are built into the contract. So it's sold, assumed to be in as-is condition, in its present physical condition as of the date of acceptance, subject to buyer's investigation rights. Buyer has the right to inspect. Buyer has the right to make repair requests. Seller is under no obligation to complete the repairs that buyer requests, if any. Okay, seller has, buyer can investigate everything about the property. Usually the whole house inspection it's like going to your general practitioner who then refers you to your podiatrist, or in my case, psychiatrist probably. But anyway, they refer to the specialty things like a pool person or a roof person is what the home inspector is going to do. But this is just saying the property, including pool, landscaping, and grounds, are going to be maintained in substantially the same condition as of the date of acceptance. And all debris and personal property not included in sale will be removed by close of escrow. So this means that when the seller gets an accepted offer, they can't go, okay, I'm turning off all utilities, not watering anything, I'm not gonna have the pool, I'm gonna let the pool go green. Everything has to be, they have to maintain the property in the condition it was in at the time they accepted the purchase agreement. And then it talks about how seller will disclose known material facts and defects affecting the property, including any known insurance claims within the past 5 years, and will make all other disclosures required by law. And again, this reaffirms that buyer has the right to conduct investigations, and when we get to paragraph 14, which will be tomorrow, based upon the information discovered as a result of those investigations, buyer has a cancellation right, or buyer can request that seller make repairs or take other action. An example of other action, there might be a number of things that the buyer notes that they would like repaired, but they know the seller doesn't want to do any repairs. Maybe seller's already moved out of state. Who knows, whatever the reason, seller doesn't want to be the one arranging for the repairs. Another action that could be requested is that seller provide buyer with a credit. And if that's going to be the case and seller agrees to it, whatever the dollar amount is, again, that's going to be expressed as in an addendum form as a credit from seller to buyer toward buyer's recurring and non-recurring closing costs at close of escrow. If you already had a credit for buyer closing costs, it would have to be added to that, and you want to make sure that you're not exceeding the total allowable lender credit. But there's ways to skin the cat. If you come upon anything like that, you can get in touch with me and I'll help you through it. Okay, buyer is strongly advised to conduct investigations of the entire property in order to determine its present condition. Seller may not be aware of all defects affecting the property or other factors that buyer considers important. Property improvements may not be built according to code, in compliance with current law, or have had permits issued. So that's an advisory to the buyer. It's, the buyer has responsibility to make investigations. And again, seller, if anything is known to seller, they need to disclose it or they're committing fraud. But if it's not known, and you live in the property 30 years and not know some significant things about the property. So you can't assume that the seller's trying to hide it, but they should disclose everything that they know. This paragraph 12 delves in a little further into buyer's investigation of the property and all the kinds of things many of the kinds of things buyer may wish to investigate, would destroying pests and organisms, paint hazards. There's just a myriad of things that the buyer may want to investigate. One that frequently comes up is registered sex offender database. The Department of Justice has that information. But even if nothing comes up on that database now and they're making the purchase decision, that doesn't mean that somebody could not move into the area that it falls into that profile. There aren't any guarantees. It's up to the buyer to confirm insurability and that it's insurable at a cost that's agreeable to the buyer. And sometimes if there have been extensive claims on a property, it may not be, it may be pricier. Insurance may be pricier than what the buyer was anticipating. Another thing that we're encountering is with all the wildfires and the damage that has occurred because of those, so in some areas, insurance premiums are higher than what they were in the past. So that's something that the buyer should, as soon as they get into contract, really be jumping on investigating with their insurance professional. You don't want to come down to, close of escrow and you have to have insurance in order to get the loan funded. And then that's when you find out that, boy, that insurance is way more than what we thought it was going to be. This talks about seller making the property available to the buyer for all inspections, and that the buyer will either complete their inspections or remove their contingency or cancel the agreement, and give the seller at no cost complete copies of any investigation reports, all the inspection reports obtained by the buyer. The obligation to do that extends beyond the termination of the agreement. So if buyer cancels based on the contents of an inspection report, buyer is still obligated to provide that report to the seller, even the buyer is the one that paid for it. This talks about an important fact that seller will leave water, gas, electricity, and all operable pilot lights on for the buyer's investigations and through the date possession is made available to the buyer. When you have an accepted offer and your escrow is opening, you want to get your buyer inspections schedule as close to immediately as possible. And you do want to confirm with the listing agent that even if the property is vacant, if it's not vacant, you have to confirm that it's a time that seller can accommodate, as that's a common courtesy, and have the property available for buyer inspection. But if it's a vacant property, you need to make sure that they know and confirm with the listing agent that all the utilities are on, because you can't conduct an inspection with without those things being on and operable. And then this just says that the buyer indemnifies the seller for anyone entering the property. So if an inspector comes and climbs up on the roof and falls off the roof, that is the buyer has indemnified seller for any damages arising out of that. And then title and vesting. This is how the manner in which buyer is going to take title. We cannot advise them as to how to take title. What we need to do is make sure they know there are tax consequences and there are legal consequences as a result of their choice on taking title, and they should consult their tax professional and or an attorney if they feel that they need advice on how to take title. The title companies generally all of them seem to have a nice, easy to read sheet on the various ways of holding title, and they can provide the sheet to the buyer so the buyer can read and understand the differences. But again, the title people can't advise them on how they should do it. The escrow people cannot advise them on how they should take their vesting for the property. And again, this says the manner of taking title may have significant legal and tax consequences. Consult an appropriate professional. We are not the appropriate professional to advise on that. All right. We have 10 minutes for any questions or discussion. We're not going to dive into paragraph 14 until tomorrow, and we'll spend a lot of time on paragraph 14 tomorrow. My request and advice is read this paragraph between now and tomorrow. And paragraph page 6 is paragraph 14. It's the whole page. So this is really a significant paragraph, and I request that you read it between now and tomorrow, and we will delve into it. Get your questions written down, and we will tear this puppy apart tomorrow. Any other questions have popped up?
Do you have a question? If CR1 is signed before work agreed upon in the request for repairs and work is inferior, what recourse has buyer got? I can't talk.
So if I understand the scenario correctly, they have come to an agreement on the repairs that will be done, and accordingly and timely, the buyer then has removed the inspection. The inspection contingency has been removed in writing with their contingency removal form. So, and then you come to check on the work and it's not done properly. You have the walkthrough, and that's 5 days prior to close of escrow, but when there's repairs being done, often they're not done until getting up close to close of escrow anyway. They're not completed. And if you find they're done in an inferior fashion, you have to go back and come up with some sort of alternate agreement. Either a buyer gets a bid from somebody who's going to do it properly and submit that invoice to escrow would be one way, and seller pays for it to be done properly. And again, it's rigmarole, and you have to be pretty insistent about it. and not just let it pass. So that would be one thing that could happen. I would say you might get a credit from the seller, but bear in mind that the lender, buyer's lender, has to do a closing disclosure, and that has to, you can't do last minute credits anymore like we used to be able to do. So if it's like a 3-day waiting period, and if there's an additional credit that's going to be given, then lender has to go back and reissue the closing disclosure all over again, and that 3-day waiting period has to expire, and it can add time to the closing. So a last minute credit is not usually going to be a very viable option. But a workaround on that is, let's say it was a fence repair that was supposed to be done, and what they did was just prop a 2x4 up against the leaning fence instead of doing a proper fence repair. Then you would need to have a bid from a qualified professional to get it done. And they, you agree to this contractually. I mean, sometimes it could get sticky, and you could get people just patently refusing to do it. And in that scenario, if they just won't do it, the buyer would have to take in small claims. But usually you can get some sort of resolution, again, like the buyer selecting their service provider and getting an invoice submitted to escrow for the seller to pay for it to be done after close of escrow.
I've got 2 more. One's a follow-up from Patrick on his question. So best to ask for credit towards buyer's recurring, etc., then to introduce repairs to lender?
If they won't fund the loan, if you tell them you never are going to submit your request for repairs to the lender, all of them will tell you, I don't want to see it, I don't want to hear about it, I don't want to know about it. They know, the lenders know that, okay, we've gone here, they've done the inspection, and then all of a sudden there's a buyer credit 15 days into it, the seller's giving a credit. They're not stupid. They know what it's for. But bear in mind, they're packaging up their loans to be sold, and the last thing they want to see in there is that they're lending, and this loan is based on a property that credit was given for needed repairs, and how do they know that the buyer is actually going to use the money that they were credited to make those repairs? So lender does not want to see anything about carpet allowance. You'll see that sometimes in MLS. Don't put that in the purchase agreement. Don't put seller shall credit buyer, $3,000 for carpet allowance. Don't do that. The lender's lending on the property as it is, as it stands, and they have no assurance that they're not going to lend on the value of the property with that new carpet in it or with those repairs made. They're lending on what it is, where it is, as it stands. So don't put any reference to repairs or improvements in the contract.
What is normal withholding deposit on SIP forms that escrow can hold?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you say that again?
What is normal withholding deposit on SIP forms that escrow can hold?
I need some.
Arena, if you could give more clarification so that Andrea can understand your question.
I'm wondering if this is a reference to the FERPTA disclosure, the withholding requirements on FERPTA.
He's talking about the SIP.
Well,
Like
SIP,
how much of a deposit should be withheld, it sounds like.
Escrow doesn't. Escrow wants to close things out. Thank you, Jeannie. So escrow wants to close it out. Escrow doesn't want to hold deposit and keep it open. They don't do that anymore. They used to be willing to hold deposits after close of escrow and disperse funds later. But that's been a long time since I've seen an escrow company that wants any part of that. For an SIP, seller in possession, that can be anything and everything. So on the SIP or RLAS, residential lease after sale, some sellers get morbidly offended at the idea that the buyer wants a deposit withheld, like they're going to mess up their own property after close of escrow. They just need a few days to vacate for one reason or another. There isn't a normal amount. Everything is going to be situational. But if a buyer wants a deposit held, it would be paid to the buyer, and then the buyer would have to refund it if all the terms are met. I don't see escrow companies wanting to hold those things, and we're certainly not going to be holding it.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. If you've got a question, go ahead and type it in really quick. Ooh, hold on. Oh, that was just Irina saying thank you. Anyway, thank you so much for being on today. This has been recorded. Those of you that had to cut out a little bit early, we will send it out. Just so you understand, it gets recorded into the cloud, then sent to me via email. So sometimes it takes a little longer, and then we have to put it into YouTube to convert to get it out to you. So sometimes it's not immediate, and it'll either be out to you by the end of the day today or sometime tomorrow, by the time we're able to get it all packaged and sent out to all of you. I hope to see you on tomorrow's webinar to finish out the RPA. And if you do have further questions, you can send them over to the transaction department. You can send them to Andrea. There will be a little survey after this that I have set up. So you can there's a box you can ask your questions in that. It'll come to me and I will get them forwarded to the appropriate person. And have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.